So, good morning. We are glad to have you join us this morning. As a church, we have the opportunity to support each other in many different ministry opportunities and in many different ways. And at times, that includes supporting someone in our congregation who has been spending time in a service assignment. And this past year, Sophie Miller spent most of the school year in Guatemala with Mennonite Mission Network following her graduation from Heston College. And we're thankful that this morning she's willing to share from her experiences from the past year, which was cut short, like a lot of things, by the coronavirus. So I've given her a number of general questions to respond to, but folks who are watching live will have the opportunity to ask questions as well. So with that, we will turn our time over to Sophie. Go ahead.
Hi, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to share with you today. My name is Sophie Miller. My parents are Kevin and Lorene, and my grandparents, Don and Sylvia, who all attend Waterford. I graduated from Heston College in 2019, last spring, and I decided to take a gap year after that, instead of transferring to another university. And so this past 7 months, starting in last August, I was in Guatemala. I was participating in a program called CASAS, which stands for Central American Study and Service, which is a program of Samia Seminary in Guatemala City. And I was connected with them through Mennonite Mission Network. So I'm going to share my screen to show some pictures as I go along through the presentation. So this first picture here is the Samia Seminary in Guatemala City. Their campus houses Samia, the seminary CASAS program, and they have a Casa Emmaus guest house, so the profit that they make from CASAS and the guest house all help support low-income seminary students that are studying at Samia. In helping fund my time there also helped fund the seminary students. One of the main things, or one of the reasons that I chose to do this, there's several reasons. One of them was that I wanted to take some time off of school to help better understand what I wanted to study and what I might want to do with a career, give myself more time to figure that out before continuing to study. And I also wanted to improve my Spanish skills and to get to know a culture that was different than my own, to better understand the world. So through this experience, I hope that I can be a better ally to immigrants coming from Central America, since I better understand where they're coming from, as well as other marginalized people in the US, such as indigenous groups, coming from my experience living with an indigenous family in Guatemala that I'll talk a lot more about later. So the CASA programs, they offer Spanish classes on campus and also online, and they help make connections for host families and internships around Guatemala. And like I said, it helps support low-income seminary students that come from all over Latin America. One unique thing about Samia is that the students are rarely on campus. The teachers actually go out to the different countries and communities to teach them in their own community, so they're more able to work while studying. Also just want to give a little bit of an introduction to Guatemala so we know where we're coming from. It's the most northern country in Central America, which I want to note that because there's it's a highway for migrants coming from other parts of Central America to Mexico and the US. So it's a very important issue there. It's one reason that US policy with Guatemala is really important, especially with the immigration issues. There were two different parts to my time while I was in Guatemala. So if you can see my mouse on the screen, I was in Guatemala City, the capital here, for 3 months. And then 4 months in my internship, I was in Lake Atitlan over here. It's about 4 hours from the city. While Guatemala is about the size of Ohio, and it's very mountainous, and so it takes a while to get from place to place. While I was in Guatemala City, I stayed with a host family who were about 30 minutes walking from their house to the Samia campus. And so that was one of the first challenges that I kind of had to overcome. I came into Guatemala with a lot of misconceptions that I think a lot of people have about Latin America cities, and that's the danger in those cities of being out on the streets. And I think that's a very much stereotype danger about Latin America cities, which to some extent holds truth. There's a little bit of truth to stereotypes, but I do think it is a little bit blown out of proportion. That's something that I learned while walking around alone in the city. It may be a little bit more prevalent in Guatemala City, but they do have the same crimes happening that our big American cities do. So while you still need to be cautious, it doesn't completely rule your life while you're living there, as some stereotypes might say. So in the mornings then, I had 4-hour lessons, Spanish lessons. These pictures here are with my teacher Edna, who I was with for 2 months, and then I was with another teacher for my last month of study. 4 hours is a long time to do some intense Spanish study, so they had a 30-minute coffee break halfway through, which was a really fun time to talk with other students who were taking Spanish lessons, and then to also talk with some of the Samia faculty. We also could organize different activities and excursions with our teachers to help with our language learning and culture learning. So it was a good way to break up the week of long study. Some examples of what I did with my teacher Edna here. We made food one morning. We watched 2 movies in Spanish. We visited the zoo and visited a giant topographical map of Guatemala. It was also really fun having a one-on-one learning situation, since I got to hear more of her perspectives. So in the morning, we would debrief the previous afternoon's culture and historical learnings that I did with CASAS, and I could hear more of her perspective on those topics as well, which was really valuable. And like I said, so in the afternoons, they were filled with culture and historical activities, all organized through CASAS. They varied from having guest speakers come and talk about central topics or learning from Samia staff. We also visited museums and organizations in the city. Each week focused on a different theme. Some of those themes included indigenous people, economics, religion, civil war, peace and justice post-Civil War, immigration factors, and environmental issues in Guatemala. We also did some overnight trips to different regions of Guatemala. One of them I have pictured here is at Lake Amatitlan, which is about 45 minutes, an hour south of Guatemala City. I'm pictured here with Elise, the assistant director of CASAS, and then Lauren and Rachel Johns, who were serving with Mennonite Mission Network at CASAS, being hosts at the guest house there. And so we had this afternoon trip to this lake to learn about some of the environmental issues there due to pollution that's affecting the lake. We also had some weekend trips and overnight several-day trips to different regions of Guatemala, which was really valuable to learn about the different cultures, because each part of Guatemala has their own unique and rich cultures. One of the trips that we did was to Lake Atitlan, and on the way there we stopped at Ixinche Mayan ruins, and we got to learn about the history of the ancient Maya and some of their story. That was really, really interesting and valuable. We also had other trips, went up to the highlands here to a city called Coban, and there we got to sit in and on a worship with an indigenous Mennonite church. This was a part of a learning tour of people from different Mennonite churches in the US that came down. And so it was really cool seeing an indigenous Mennonite church worship in their own language, even though I couldn't understand much of it. In that same trip, we also got to sit in on a Samia class with some of their seminary students. And that was also really cool seeing how it was translated into their indigenous language. Being in the highlands in a highly indigenous region, the indigenous language is the first language that people learn, and Spanish is their second language. And so they got to translate, or the teacher taught in their first language, and that was really special to see. In the beginning of December, I moved to Santiago Atitlan, or more specifically, the village of Panava. This is on the shores of Lake Atitlan, and just to give a little introduction to the lake here, we would arrive through Panachel, which is the port city here, and it was about a 30-minute boat ride across the lake to Santiago. The lake has a really rich Mayan culture, and it's also very touristy, both for that reason and for the beauty of the lake. Santiago is the capital of the Sutu'il Maya, and so over 90% of this town is Sutu'il indigenous, and so with that, most of community life there is done in that language, and most of the people in the town would then have Spanish as a second language. Here, if you can see in the picture, this is the Bay of Santiago with the town there. So I lived about 10 minutes outside of the town, 10 minutes walking, just a few minutes in the pickup. And then I worked way down at the end of the bay. It's about 10 minutes in the pickup as well, or 45 minutes to walk. This is my host family who I lived with for 4 months. So this picture is with me and them the first day that I got there. You can see my host mother Maria here and my host sister Amelia. And then there's the other people are the other cousins and aunts that lived there. So it was a group of 4 siblings and their families that kind of lived with all their houses connected. So there are always lots of people around, always something happening. It was very fun family. In this other picture here, I'm with my host sister and host mom and host aunt. We're making tamales on New Year's Eve. Tamales are very traditional for both New Year's and Christmas. And that's kind of all we ate that day. We'd make them the day before and just have tamales the whole day the next day. So I learned how to assemble those that day. One thing that was challenging here was the language. So like I said, everything in the community and in the family is in their traditional language, Sutu'il, which is spelled out down here for you. So the men and the kids, young women would, however, the older women don't have that, they don't know Spanish as well. So it's difficult communicating with my host mom and my host grandma sometimes. I had to rely on the translation of my host sister sometimes through Spanish. So there's something definitely to get used to. I did learn a few words and phrases in their language, and they also, they're starting to lose the language, so there's lots of Spanish words mixed in. So through that and through context, you can pick up a little bit of what they're talking about, but it's still a lot of translating for me. One thing that I learned is about their culture is that it's very family-centered, which is something that I really learned to value. As I said before, it's 4 siblings living together, and that's very common for the area. You would always live with your larger family. And so one thing that I learned is that some things in one culture don't necessarily translate to another culture, but they'll work in their individual cultures. For example, one night I was talking with my host sister, Amelia, about nursing homes. And she said that someone had tried to build a nursing home in their community for the elderly, but it didn't last very long because it was seen as if you were to take your grandmother or your grandfather to go live in this home and not to live with you, it was seen as pretty harsh and kind of cold-hearted. Like, why don't you want them to live with you? They would ask those people. So I don't know how long it lasted, but she said not very long. And so that's something, the difference where nursing homes work in our own culture, but it's seen very foreign and doesn't necessarily work there. Whereas here, it doesn't, it seems foreign to live with so much of your family. While I was in Santiago, I worked with the organization Untitled. It's written down here, which essentially means the good life, more or less, in English. This organization plays many different roles. They are building a sustainable campus with adobe houses. So this is an example here of a completed cabin that they have, and they actually have it rented out. They use recycled bottles, glass bottles, to create murals on the walls. It's also let in more light, and it's really beautiful. They are also creating a small coffee and fruit farm just behind these houses here, and they're creating a larger guest house, which you can see me working on here, putting the mud into the foundation of the walls. So this is a place that they'll use for both community events, and then they also host North American student groups and help host their learning about the area and the culture. And so this guest house, this large meeting house that they have is like will be the central part of that in the future, as well as the cabins being a place to stay. They also organize host days in the community for these students. The idea with Uzkaz Limal is that I would be working alongside all parts of the community and not just with their organization. So I had different placements within the community. Depending on the day, I'd go to different places. So I was with them a few days a week, doing very hands-on building and learning about their process. I was also with an organization called ADICAP, which is a non-for-profit organization, and I worked with their tree nursery. So they work towards community development and reforestation. And they also promoted the use of organic fertilizer for like the community to use. My other place that I worked was in the Panama school, helping with some of the English classes. This ended up being one of my biggest challenges while in the community. It ended up being something different that I wasn't quite expecting to turn out as it did, and it's something that I decided not to continue after 2 months of doing it and to focus on the other two organizations that I was in. I still have some really good memories from the school, from working with some really cool teachers and some really good moments with the students as well. One of my greatest takeaways of this experience was gaining a huge respect for Indigenous people. I learned how Indigenous voices are often left out of the picture, but their worldview is very important. Sometimes like the Western ways aren't always the best. And I think that's especially true with environmental issues, because traditionally Indigenous people are very rooted in their connection to the earth, and they value resources more. So I think that as we look to create a more sustainable future, I think it's important that we look towards Indigenous people and ideologies to kind of guide us. In this photo here, we had hosted a group of college students from the US that were studying abroad in Costa Rica, and they visited with us for a few days. We are pictured here with them and a group of Mayan men. They're called tuleros. Their job is to take care of the reeds around the edge of the lake, and these reeds naturally filter the water. And so this is something that they're doing to combat pollution in the lake. With this same group, then we learned about this pipeline project, a water pipeline project that's supported by the government. And the idea of the project is that it would take the water out over top of the mountain in this pipeline, clean it, and then return it to the lake. However, when we were talking to the indigenous leaders, we learned that there's lots of things left out of the pipeline proposal. And the indigenous leaders suspect that since this project is funded by the plantation owners on the other side of the mountain, they suspect that the water would be taken over the mountain and it wouldn't be returned. And it'd be used for irrigation on these plantations. And so we learned about both this project that this organization was wanting to do, and also what the indigenous leaders thought about it and what were their own ways of working towards combating pollution and doing like wastewater management. And so I just learned a lot about how there's this ongoing justice needed for indigenous people. And I think, or this definitely extends to the US. Every time that indigenous voices are left out of the conversation, it's just a continuation of colonialism. And so like within the US, we see these very similar situations with, as we hear in the news about oil pipeline projects and other projects going through indigenous sacred areas. And overall, my learnings in Guatemala have really connected to the US. I've learned about issues in Guatemala, but they're also very prevalent in the US and the rest of the world. So learning about them first in Guatemala before looking at them in the US, it allowed me to look critically at the issue in a country and setting where I had less bias, and then being able to see that issue more clearly in a country in a place where I had more bias, and it was harder to see originally. I also want to share about some of the beauty of the country that Guatemala gives and the fun things that I got to enjoy. So these are some of the pictures around the lake. We got to do some hikes to some different lookouts here, and it's just an absolutely gorgeous lake with some volcanoes around that just absolutely beautiful. We also hiked to this waterfall, and on the way there we were able to see a quetzal bird, which is the national bird of Guatemala. It's quetzal, or quetzala as they say in Spanish, and it's also the Guatemalan currency, and it's a very special bird to many Central American countries, and is involved in a lot of myths and legends. This picture, central picture here, was the dock that I would often go swimming at with my host sister. So that was something fun that I did with her on many afternoons after work. And then this bottom picture here is when my brother was able to visit me for 2 weeks back in February. One morning we hiked, or one afternoon we hiked this volcano with my host uncle and a few other people, and we actually camped on top of the volcano, and we were able to see the sunrise, and in the distance we saw another volcano erupting that does a little eruption every day. That was a really cool experience. That was back in February. And then in March, I traveled to Guatemala City. I was going to spend a week with a group of EMU students, doing a week of service with them. So I was in Guatemala City with them. We never got to our service assignments, however, because the Guatemalan government started shutting everything down due to the pandemic. So we spent 1 week in quarantine at the Samia campus. So it's a great place to be in quarantine in the city. So we were there for a week. The restrictions were a lot stronger than what the US has in place. There was a curfew starting from 4 p.m. to 4 a.m. Nobody could be out in the streets except for essential personnel. There was limited travel between the different regions of Guatemala. So where I was with my host family at the lake was about 4 hours from the city, so there was no travel between those two places, as well as all the borders were shut down, the airport was shut down, but it kind of paused everything. So we eventually got a flight, a US charter government flight from the airport to Miami, and then eventually back to Indiana. So with talking with my Mennonite mission network and my CASAS leaders, we all decided that it was best that I travel back with the EMU group and with Lauren and Rachel Johns to the United States, not knowing how long this was going to last. So I ended up leaving early and very abruptly, but now I'm home and I'm glad to be here. It was definitely the right decision to be made, seeing how long this is going on and could go on. So yeah, it's good to be home. I will plan on being here in Goshen all the summer. I'm hoping to get certified as a CNA and find a job like that for the summer. And then I will be going to EMU, Eastern Mennonite University, in the fall. I'll be studying biology and minoring in sociology. And then beyond that, I'm interested in studying more and working in the field of public health. This was something that I had decided on, or wanting to work in public health was something that I had decided on before leaving for Guatemala, but it was something that was definitely cemented more in, and I knew that it was what I wanted to do throughout my time in Guatemala. Thank you to everyone who has supported me financially to make this experience possible, and in prayers throughout my time in Guatemala. I'm really grateful to have this community of supporters, and thank you all for listening today. I think now is the time for questions. If anyone has any, you can type them in.
Okay, again, feel free to type in if you're participating live. You can type in questions by hitting the Q&A button at the bottom. I'm sure if you're watching this later, you could always reach out to Sophie and ask her questions, have some follow-up. I had a couple of questions. One was you mentioned the immigration piece of Guatemala being a place where many folks from Central America are traveling through and going to Mexico and the US and so forth. I'm curious what your sense of perception of the US was in Guatemala, either both in the city or also in the indigenous areas that you were with. What was your sense of how people perceive the US? And did you feel some of those feelings directed towards you as well?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, generally, I perceived that there was a very positive view of the U.S. Yeah, I didn't hear, especially in the indigenous community, very positive. People don't know much about the U.S. They would often ask me, to describe it to them. What is it like there? It's kind of this far off place to them, as is, Guatemala maybe to a lot of us here. So I was often asked to describe it, you know, like just things like the landscape. Yeah.
Can you describe a bit more of what you experienced in the Indigenous worship service that you were part of?
Yeah, it was very loud. um, and then I couldn't understand, you know, the language, but like the beautiful, like the singing was just beautiful. Um, yeah, it was, I don't know, it was great. Yeah.
Another person asked, were there experiences in your formative years that made you want to spend a year abroad? What encouraged you to this experience?
My family did a lot of traveling, especially around the US, when I was younger. And so that's something that has, has helped me value um, getting to know a different place and what those different perspectives can teach you. Um, Even around the US, the different communities have different cultures, different perspectives that help influence your worldview. And so I wanted to expand my worldview as I have seen it done in the past in communities within the US. Yeah, and I took Spanish in high school for 4 years. And so that was the basis of Spanish that I had that, and in those Spanish classes, we also learned about a little bit of the culture of Latin America. And so I just wanted to get to know that on a deeper level.
And speaking of the culture of Latin America, how would you describe the Guatemalan people? And are there things that we can learn from them?
Mhm. Well, they're very nice, very welcoming. I highlighted a little bit about um, the family centeredness that they have, and I think that's something that we can learn a lot about them. They also, and generally, I believe it to be true that in Latin America, the scheduling, it's not as strict. So like in the US, we're very want to follow a schedule. We're leaving at this time, starting at this time. Whereas in Guatemala, it's a little looser and it's more about the relationships. It's more about the conversations that you have with the person and valuing that over sticking to a strict time schedule.
Sure. And maybe following up on that, did you also notice differences, or what differences did you experience in the city versus when you were living in the internship experience in a more indigenous setting?
Mm-hmm. I think a lot of like those values I spoke on, the family values, they're much stronger in the indigenous community. And some of it, and as well as the community, is a little bit more tightly connected. And some of that might be the traditional big city versus smaller town that you see. But I think it also has to do with the indigenous histories that they have.
Yeah. Did when you were in, did you have the opportunity to work or visit in any of the smaller villages aside from the one that you were living in?
Um, it was mainly around the lake that we visited different villages. There was one other small village between where I lived and where I worked. And so some of the people that I worked with were from that village. So I also visited some of their homes there. I did get to visit all the host homes that they had students stay in within my village. And that was really interesting seeing the different types of home that they have in the villages. My family was definitely a little bit more, I'd say like middle class, considered middle class in their community. So I saw some of the poorer homes and some of the richer homes in the community. Yeah.
Yeah, and speaking of, yeah, the differences in income, what would you say about the economic life within Guatemala?
Mhm.
What was, was there a pretty high degree of difference between in income levels, for example, or what's the overall economic circumstances within Guatemala?
Mhm. Yeah, there's a huge economic difference, even more so than the US. There's the 1% that's very, very rich. They just have a lot of power. This would be and it's also kind of ethnically divided. So that would also be the more people of European descent. And then there is a huge, I think it's about 80% is in poverty, and about 20% of that 80% is extreme poverty. And people in poverty tend to be the indigenous people.
And the indigenous, you mentioned the Mayan culture. Is the indigenous component very Mayan driven, or are there quite a variety of indigenous cultures that are present?
Yeah. So there are actually 21 different groups of Mayan cultures, and each of those groups have their own languages and slightly different cultures and regions that they're in. So the whole Mayan culture itself has its own little cultures. There would also be 2 other indigenous groups that aren't a part of the whole Mayan group.
Yeah. How might we at Waterford learn more or connect more with indigenous people?
That's a great question. I don't know how great of an answer I have for this. Within the US, I mean, first, I think just learning, like educating yourself about their issues, like learning to hear, especially their voice. So going beyond like what you might hear in the news, and trying to find a source that comes from an indigenous person. Yeah, that's something that I'm also working on myself, coming back here and thinking, how can I engage in learning about indigenous people in the US? That's something I'm still trying to figure out too.
Yeah, well, and I picked up, you said you're thinking of minoring in sociology. Was that something that grew out of your experiences from the past year?
Yeah, I had been thinking about that before going to Guatemala, but it's something that, especially in my time with the indigenous groups, it made me want to do it more. It's like, yes, this is something I want to focus on.
Yeah, yeah. Did I mentioned earlier, or you mentioned the immigration piece. Did you personally see or meet any Central Americans who were on their way to the U.S. Wanting to seek asylum? Or did you have any interactions there?
Yeah, I didn't have a lot of interactions or a lot of exposure to the immigration issues. Most of it came in my time studying with CASAs in Guatemala City. The week that we did talk about immigration issues, we visited a migrant center in Guatemala City. And so in that center, we would have seen people who were either on their way to the US or people who had been deported, and were getting help from the center. It's a place to stay, offering legal medical services. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. When you think of the relationships that you developed and to go to the question about how we might learn and so forth, are there particular ministries in Guatemala that that from your perspective it would make sense for Waterford to try to connect with in a more intentional way and support in a more intentional way?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, Samia is a very good connection in Guatemala. They're an Anabaptist seminary, so they're connected with other Mennonite institutions as well, and they're currently exploring connections with other Mennonite churches in the U.S. And then with them, they have connections all around Guatemala. So making a connection with them will also make connections with other parts of Guatemala.
Sure. So that would be a very key linking point. Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. Were there how many others with Mennonite Mission Network were in Guatemala as part of the same program that you were part of?
As a part of CASAs?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I was the only CASAs student through Mennonite Mission Network. This was the first connection that they've done with CASAs. It's a new connection with Mennonite Mission Network.
Okay.
I was the one with CASAs. Then Rachel and Lauren Johns were serving with Mennonite Mission Network at the guest house of Samia. And so they were in Guatemala City there. Then Mennonite Mission Network also has a worker up in the Koban region where we visited the Mennonite church, who has been working there for over a decade.
Okay. Do you have a sense as to how long Mennonite Mission Network has had connections in Guatemala overall?
Oh, for Mennonite Mission Network specifically, I'm not quite sure. I know there have been some Mennonite connections kind of starting in the Civil War, 70s, 80s, 90s. The Mennonite church grew a lot.
Yeah, yeah. You mentioned the Civil War during your sharing. Give a bit of a background, recognizing that you probably didn't become an expert in Guatemalan history during the time you were there, but give a bit of a sense of the issues or what was happening in at that time.
Yeah, so it was a 36-year-long civil war from the 60s to 1996 was when they had the peace, and it was guerrilla warfare. So it was the government versus different guerrilla groups. A lot of the violence was targeted towards indigenous people and has actually been labeled as a genocide or attempted genocide by many people. So there were many like massacres that happened. I didn't talk much about this, but even in the village that I was in, there's a massacre where they have a peace park set up to remember the people that died. It was very, very violent and hard, especially against indigenous people.
Yeah, and now that's, I mean, it's a little more than 20 years since, or close to 25 years since that has concluded. How strong of a sense of how strong of a memory, I guess maybe would you say, is that still part of the culture?
Mm-hmm. I'd say it's still pretty strong. I mean, there's still a lot of people that remember it.
Yeah.
Yeah, hearing from the indigenous community that I was in, hearing their story about remembering this massacre that happened, but then also in Guatemala City with Samia, it's very strong. The director of Samia, Willie Hugo, he has a great story about his father in the Civil War and losing him. And then there's other people from Samia that I've heard stories of their experience with their family members going like seeing this violence and how that went for them. So.
Yeah, sure. What, and this will be my last question unless any others chime in with questions. What words of counsel or suggestion would you have for folks who want to either learn more about Guatemala or might want to think about spending time in Guatemala?
Well, if you're wanting to spend time in Guatemala, I would just reach out to CASAs. They speak English. The director and assistant director both speak English, so you can communicate that with them directly very easily. So whether if you're wanting to do like a gap year or an extended time, or if you just want to do like a week or 2 weeks, you could reach out to them, and they can adapt it to what you're looking for very easily.
Mm-hmm.
So reaching out to them would be
Yeah.
a good part. Mm-hmm.
So someone could do that, even just reaching out to them directly, or going through Mission Network either.
Yeah, you could also go through Mission Network as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Good. Well, thank you so much for your time with us this morning, Sophie. This has been really great. I'm sure that folks who've been listening in have appreciated it, and folks who will pay attention or who will watch it later will also be thankful for you. We really appreciate your willingness to share with us this morning, and wish you God's blessing as you continue on and head towards EMU in the fall.
Yeah, thank you.
So thanks.